But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most trusted voice in true crime. Now, I don't know about you, but the previous letter was, for me, a little bit dull. It took a bit of effort to get through, even though I'm the creator of the series. There wasn't really much in it except a mention of Theo's wife Jo struggling with her health. And I'm happy to say that Vincent's response is pretty exciting. It's quite an exciting letter for quite a few reasons. And so without any further ado, let's get into it. It's a letter written today, 130 years ago, from Auvers-sur-Oise in France, on Tuesday, the 24th of June, 1890. Vincent writes, "My dear Theo, thanks very much for your letter and for the 50-franc note it contained. The exchange you made with Gogh is very good, and am very curious to see what sort of thing he's making at present. I hope that Jo's health is better, since you say that she's been indisposed. Indeed, you must come here as soon as possible. Nature is very, very beautiful here, and I'm longing to see you all again." So once again, we have a return to the familiar theme of kind of loneliness, where he's sort of just saying, come here, come and see me. But I also just want to touch on where he says nature is very, very beautiful here. He doesn't say nature is beautiful here. He doesn't say nature is very beautiful here. He says nature is very, very beautiful here. And I can second that. As you know, I was in Auvers-sur-Oise around about this time last year, a little bit earlier, actually in May, and I was astonished. I don't know what I imagined. I think I imagined would be pretty. I think I imagined it would be scenic. But and after being in awe, I think I sort of thought I can kind of go home now, and I've sort of had my fill. I've been filled up with the beauty of France. I've seen I've glimpsed what Van Gogh glimpsed, when he walked those roads and fields. And yet when I went to Auvers-sur-Oise, whatever I saw in Arles was totally, it was just, it was absolutely stunning. It was really, really beautiful. Just, you don't imagine that a town can feel like a garden. You don't imagine that a town can have such a unique character, and that such a small space can be so quaint and like a fairy tale. And I can only imagine, as beautiful as it was when I was there, I can only imagine when he was there, that it must have been almost heartbreakingly beautiful. And there's certain things in the world when if you experience them on your own, it's almost tragic. It's almost tragic not to be able to share something so lovely, And don't you sometimes get that sense where something is so compelling and so it's not just something. It's not something that's just beautiful or pretty, but it actually touches you. It touches your soul, and you sort of feel, wow, I really wish I could share this with someone, And I wonder if that wasn't what he was feeling, not just sharing it with his family, but wanting to share it with someone special, wanting to take a walk with someone through all of that loveliness, wanting to watch the sun go down with someone and all that kind of thing. Anyway, he goes on to say, Mr. Perron, that's his doctor in Saint-Remy, wrote to me 2 days ago. His letter is enclosed. I told him that it seemed to me sufficient to give the lads 10 francs or so. So I think what he's done is he's now paid for the furniture that I think he finally got. So in other words, the furniture I think got it's either his furniture or it's the canvases from Saint-Remy. I'm not 100% sure. But in any event, he relied on people in Saint-Remy and in Aal to get certain things to him, and now that was requiring payment. Anyway, he goes on to say, now the canvases from down there have arrived. The irises have dried well, and I dare believe that you'll find something in them. Thus, there are also some roses, a wheat field, a little canvas with mountains, and finally a cypress with a star. And so it may be that Van Gogh didn't take some of these canvases with him because because some of them were still wet. It seems like he was painting right up until the time he left the asylum, and thus, you can't really transport them when they're wet. So that may be the reason. As far as I'm concerned, and of course I'm not a professional art critic, I do have an opinion about art. I don't really think any of these works are particularly worth, as far as I'm concerned, you could have really left them in Saint-Remy. None of them are really that great. The one cypress road with a cypress and the stars, not bad. But also not terribly good. He goes on to say, this week I've done a portrait of a young girl of 16 or so, in blue against a blue background, the daughter of the people where I'm lodging. I gave her that portrait, but I've done a variant for you, a number 15 canvas. And this is really the crux of this, what this letter, what I want to highlight about this letter. It's this portrait of, I think her name is Adeline Ravoux. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. There are a couple of things to say about this. First of all, you may remember that at this time Van Gogh wanted to do Dr. Gachet's daughter's picture, and he still hasn't done it. And in this time, instead, he's done the portrait of a young girl. I think it's a terrible portrait. I really don't think it's a good portrait. I think if Adeline saw it, I don't think she would have thought much of it. I don't think any girl or young woman would have thought a portrait like that makes them look beautiful or is worth having. I'm not quite sure about this. I'm a little bit uncertain, but I have a feeling that she gave it away. She didn't like the picture, her family didn't like it, and so it was sort of given away. And they liked Van Gogh kind of as a person and respected him because he was staying there, and he was like a client. But I don't think they probably thought he's an eccentric artist. I don't think they necessarily thought that his work was that great. They liked having him around, they liked him, getting an income from him, but I don't think they thought his work was that great. The thing about giving the artwork away, I say under correction, I could be wrong. I'd like to find out for you, but unfortunately got so many things on the go, I can't really afford to spend 10 minutes making sure on this, but I'm sure Mr. Pictor, if you're listening, maybe you can confirm that for us. Now that we're on the subject of Adeline Ravoux, I'm very very excited about this because she's a very, very, very important witness in this story. You're going to find out that when Van Gogh was injured, bleeding from a gunshot wound, she saw him. She was there. And bear in mind, she was a little girl at the time. She was 16 years old. She lived quite far into the 20th century, and she was interviewed and she asked about Van Gogh, and she gave quite a lot of very, very interesting information about what she observed. and we're going to go into that as well. Very, very, very interesting witness testimony from her. Bear in mind she had a personal, direct contact with Van Gogh, a one-on-one experience with him at the very important time of his life, and he even did her portrait. So, there's no. We say in Afrikaans, daar's geen sprake. How do you say that in English? There's no. No one can claim that he didn't know Adeline, because obviously if he did her portrait he had to have known, and of course as the innkeeper's daughter one would have expected him to know, but it is quite interesting that he did her portrait, and it's also interesting that he doesn't mention her name. He refers to her kind of indirectly as a young girl and gives her age, and it's also interesting that he paints the daughter of the people where I'm lodging. He doesn't actually paint Monsieur Ravu or his wife as he did at the Yellow House. Maybe he felt a bit uncertain about doing that, given what happened with the Yellow House, or maybe not. Maybe they didn't really want to sit, and anyway, it seems like maybe he made a bit of a friend of this young girl, or just managed to talk to her and gain her confidence, and maybe there was just a little bit of familiarity that had developed between them. One can imagine her maybe cleaning a coffee stain or a wine stain or an absinthe stain off his table, maybe cleaning pieces of cheese or bread, if he ate in the restaurant, off his table, and saying, good morning and whatever. So maybe that's how there was just the beginnings of a sense of familiarity between the artist and this teenager. Okay, and then he goes on to say, then I have a canvas 1 meter long by only 50 centimeters high of fields of wheat. And this is a painting that he did in Orvez. It was obviously painted in 1890, and it's currently in a museum in Vienna. I think it's the Oostenrijkse Galerie Belvedere in Vienna. Also not one of his nicest paintings in Orvez. And then he talks about, he says it makes a pendant of undergrowth, lilac trunks of poplars, and underneath them some flower dotted grass, pink, yellow, white, and various greens. And there he's talking about a painting he did in Orvez of a couple walking between rows of poplars, and that was the first thing that I noticed when I arrived at Orvez. Literally stepping off the train the day that I arrived, within about 2, 3, 4 minutes, literally just across from the train station was this sort of beautiful scene of poplars at the roadside, and I'll be damned if that isn't where Van Gogh painted that particular picture. So it took him all of kind of a month to execute that particular picture. I did it the day that I arrived, but obviously based on what I remembered him doing. But it was nevertheless very scenic. I'm sure I would have taken a picture of it even had Van Gogh not painted something like that. It was just a really beautiful scene. And I think I told you earlier, I spent about 10 minutes bags packed, tired from a long journey. I traveled from the south of France earlier that day. I had some quite long periods of transit, waiting trains and catching trains. I had to get through Paris and so on, and nevertheless I was felt justified spending quite a long time taking photos of these these poplars. And by the way, I've actually got a printout of one of those photos in my living room, so it has meant quite a lot to me. So he goes on to say, finally a night effect, 2 completely dark pear trees against yellowing sky with wheat fields, and in the violet background the castle encased in dark scenery. And here is referring to a painting called Landscape at Twilight. Not a bad painting. It looks a bit dull. I don't know if age has dulled it, but it's quite a nice painting. It's currently in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. But that castle he's referring to is something worth talking about. I'm not going to talk about it here, but I mentioned earlier that Auvers is sort of this fairy tale place. Well, it's got this kind of French style castle in the middle of it, and if you're walking from the Revue into Dr. Gachet's home, you pass this castle, and it really is quite spectacular. It's also got beautiful gardens, and it is sort of in the center of Auvers-sur-Oise, on kind of a prominence, put it that way. And then he talks about the Dutchman, that is sort of his neighbor, that is his protege, I guess. They thinking of starting a sort of a studio that's still on their minds, and Anton Herschig is staying next door to Vincent and also doing his thing. It's strange that Vincent doesn't mention him by name. He just calls him the Dutchman. I mean, it's a weird thing to be doing because he's a Dutchman himself, and his brother's a Dutchman. So I don't quite get that. But he says the Dutchman is working quite assiduously, but still deludes himself considerably about the originality of his way of seeing. So it sounds like he's not getting along with his neighbor. Now, this is typical Van Gogh. He's an exceptional fellow. He's got a strong work ethic. He's got a strong opinion about things and so on. And you can say whatever you want about him. But he's also kind of a lonely guy. And so here is a Dutch dude coming to stay next to him, and he's also an artist. And instead of making friends with the guy and hanging out with the guy and just getting along, it seems like they have a cautious partnership, if that's the word. It doesn't seem like they're friends. It just seems like they are associates, if anything, neighbors. And one would think, who on earth would be better to get along with than this guy? This guy that's also an artist staying right next door to him. But he hardly mentions him. And I've also got to say, if Adeline Revue is a important witness to what happened to Van Gogh, because she lived in the Revue Inn. She was there when he died. She was there when he came into the inn bleeding. She was there. Anyway, so was Anton Herschig. In fact, I think it was Anton Herschig who, and I say this under correction, I would like to check it, but I think it was Anton Herschig who alerted Theo, who told Theo, that your brother's been shot. It was either him or Dr. Gachet. I'm not 100% sure which one it was. Or it was Anton Herschig who alerted Dr. Gachet, or both. But Anton Herschig played quite an important role in that. Obviously, we'll get to that when it happens. I'm just sort of letting you know that he played quite an important role, as did Adeline. So we'll get to that, but this is what he says about him. He says he's deluded. The artist thinks he's original, and Van Gogh's saying, you're not original. But then it's obviously original compared to Van Gogh, which maybe has a point. He says he does studies a little like Koning did, a little grey, a little green with a red roof, a whitening road. So he's kind of critical and dismissive of his fellow artists. He says, what can you say in a case like that? If he has money, then certainly he does right to do painting, but if he has to scheme a lot to sell them, I feel sorry for him doing it, painting, as I pity others for buying it at a price that's relatively too high. If, though, he just works assiduously every day, he might get there, but alone or with painters who work little, he wouldn't do much, I think. Just kind of almost whispering to, gossiping to his brother, just saying, this guy's not going to get anywhere. He's not. He says, I feel sorry for him, and he's kind of a little bit dismissive, and he sort of says in a bit of a patronizing way, he says, if this guy works hard every day, he might get there. It's a little bit ironic, don't you think, him saying this, because that's exactly what Van Gogh's doing. He's also working hard every day, and he didn't get there. So him saying, well, he didn't get there in his lifetime. So him saying, if he works hard every day, he might get there. It's almost as if Van Gogh is sort of saying, well, I've already gotten there, maybe this guy will get there, which is not the case. And he might think a lot of his work, and I think some artists sometimes do, but he's quite critical of his neighbor. And I don't know whether he realizes probably that people around him don't necessarily think of his art as worth much. Anyway, he goes on to say, I hope to do Miss Gachet's portrait next week, and perhaps I'll also have a country girl to pose too. So this is the other thing I want to emphasize here. In the same letter that he talks about the 16-year-old girl's portrait. Now, bear in mind, he gives it to her. He gives her the portrait, and then I think he also paints another portrait which he's going to keep. So he gives it to her as a gift, maybe as a gesture to her family, to say, thanks for having me here, and maybe I'll do this for a bottle of wine, or who knows. But in the same letter, he's thinking about doing Miss Gachet's portrait next week. He's saying, I'm hoping that I can do it next week. Why is she making him wait? Why is Marguerite Gachet making him wait? Or maybe Dr. Gachet's making him wait. Maybe they're waiting till he goes off to Paris on work or something. But it's quite interesting that he gets to do the portrait of the 16-year-old before he does the 19-year-old or 20-year-old. And then he even says, perhaps I'll also have a country girl to pose too. Now, he doesn't mention this person, but the thing to emphasize here is there are quite a few girls appearing in this particular letter. Now, you might not think too much of it, but as I say, bear in mind, this is a 37-year-old guy who's single, who probably hasn't been to a brothel for longer than he would like, and he's also still kind of on the mend from Saint-Remy, and he's not supposed to be drinking alcohol, and he's starting to get either interested or tempted by the opposite sex that he sees around him, and he's starting to become a little bit familiar with some of the young women in Auvers-sur-Oise. And I've said before that it's quite a romantic setting. There's a lot of flowers. It's got a fairy tale feel to it. And within this fairy tale now are some of these, dare I call them fairy tale creatures? That's probably overstating it. But young girls who are sort of, in certain parts of this beautiful little town. One is the innkeeper's daughter, one is the doctor's daughter, and one is a country girl. And so this is what Vincent is talking about. Then he's sort of wrapping up his letter. He says, I'm pleased that Gogh is doing this exchange with me, for I thought that relatively that they'd paid a little too much for the other canvas, being friends. So yeah, you can see Van Gogh's quite a fair guy, he's quite a modest guy. He can maybe criticize another artist, but he's also quite modest about his own work. Not necessarily critical of his own work, but just grounded, So he's just an interesting character. He goes on to say, I'd very much like to come to Paris for a few days a little later, precisely in order to go and see Kost once, to see Janine, one or two others. I'd very much like you to have Kost, and there would probably be a way of exchanging one. Gachet will come today to see the canvases from the south. Good fortune with the little one, and good handshake in thought for you and Joe. And that's it. So even in this letter, he refers to Dr. Gachet. It's almost every single letter he refers to Dr. Gachet. Almost every letter, there's some reference to him by either of the brothers, how he's involved in some commercial enterprise or something. So Dr. Gachet is very relevant in the happenings that are going on, and now his daughter's starting to become more relevant as well. Do you see that? The other thing is Vincent is now expressing interest in going to see Paris. I don't know if you remember earlier, he didn't want to go to Paris. He felt Paris was too much for him. And bear in mind, it is now the 24th of June. There's been absolutely no incident. And so let me just ask you again, do you think Van Gogh is mad? How many letters have we gone through now? Is there any sign of him being incoherent in his letters? Is there any sign of him being angry or emotional? All of it is completely sensible. All of it is about an artist purposefully going about his work, and he's got a sense of mission. He knows what he's doing. He's not lying around all day drinking. He's not being treated in a hospital. He's not being a problem to anyone. He doesn't say in his letters that he did cartwheels down the main street and now is sitting in jail. There's nothing like that. There's nothing about him stumbling home from a brothel or hanging from the chandeliers and the innkeeper had to talk him down. Nothing like that. He's just doing his work and talking to his brother who's an art dealer about this artwork and that artwork, and his brother responds. That's what they're talking about. And everyone else seems to be ill. That the little child, little baby Vincent has been a little bit ill. Joe has been ill all week. And Theo even is talking about just not feeling that great. It seems like in this particular time, the only person who's the picture of health is Vincent himself. So again, I just want to reiterate, there's this whole thing, this whole idea of Vincent as this troubled artist, Vincent as this suicidal, depressed, mad artist. Do you see any of it? Have you seen any of it for weeks now? Also, do you see any of it in his art? Do you see him sort of painting like the scream in his art? Do you sort of see a guy in the middle of a wheat field screaming, or flowers twisted in emotion or something like that? No, all of it's very peaceful, and if anything is saying how beautiful it is. And even the young girls are slowly warming to him in the area. They are not afraid of him. They don't think he's a weirdo. They think he's kind of harmless. But is he? So that is something we're going to find out in the next couple of letters. There's also, as I said, in early July, a very, very, very important letter that Theo's going to write, where Theo, who is usually quite brief in his letters and is usually not reserved, but he doesn't say as much, is quite forthcoming in a particular letter, and that we're about to get to that, and that's a very, very important letter. But as you can see, we are now coming to the end of June, and we're coming to the end of kind of the honeymoon period, the first full month in Orvers-sur-Oise, and unfortunately from there things kind of change. We're not quite there yet. It's another almost a week till the end of the month, and then it's the last month of his life. So until then, wherever you are in the world, stay safe. Make sure you smell the flowers, notice the sunshine around you, and I'll see you guys next time.